There's a quiet invitation waiting for each of us every day, an invitation to open our hearts. But what does it really mean to live with an open heart? Is it simply about kindness or being vulnerable? Or is it something far deeper, something that touches the very core of who we are? Imagine for a moment a door, heavy, locked and worn from years of being closed. Behind it lies a space filled with light, warmth, and endless possibility. Yet that door remains shut because of fear, habit, or past pain. Living with a closed heart is like living behind that door, isolated, protected, yet distant from life's true richness. An open heart, on the other hand, is like stepping through that door. It's a decision to welcome life in all its fullness, the joys, the sorrows, the uncertainties. It's about embracing vulnerability not as weakness, but as courage. To live with an open heart means to see the world and the people around us without the harsh filters of judgment and fear. In the rush of modern life, it's easy to forget this. We become caught in a whirlwind of stress, distractions, and emotional walls that keep us safe but lonely. We hide behind masks of strength, of indifference, or of control. And slowly, without realizing it, we lose touch with the gentle pulse of connection that an open heart brings. But why does opening the heart matter? What if it feels risky or too painful? The truth is, living with an open heart is not about abandoning self-protection. It's about finding a balance where compassion and courage meet. It's about allowing ourselves to feel deeply without being overwhelmed. It's about transforming the very way we relate to ourselves and others. When the heart opens, even just a crack, it begins to dissolve the walls built by loneliness and fear. It invites a new way of living, one where love flows freely, not as a fleeting emotion, but as a steady current that nourishes and heals. This isn't just poetic talk. It's a profound practice rooted in ancient wisdom and lived experience. Imagine a life where you greet each moment with openness, where you listen without judgment, forgive without resentment, and give without expectation. That life is not distant or impossible. It begins with small acts, a smile offered to a stranger, a moment of silence to acknowledge your own feelings, a choice to respond with kindness instead of anger. Opening your heart is an invitation to yourself. It's a call to step out of isolation and into the vibrant dance of connection. It asks you to be brave enough to face discomfort, uncertainty, and even pain, knowing that these are part of the human experience. But beyond them lies something greater: peace, understanding, and freedom. This journey of living with an open heart is one that will ask a lot from you: patience, persistence, and honesty. But it also promises a reward that transcends any challenge, a life that feels deeply alive, meaningful, and connected. So today, consider this your gentle invitation. What might happen if you simply opened your heart, just a little, to the world around you? What beauty might you discover? What wounds might begin to heal? There is no need to rush or force it. Like the slow blooming of a flower, opening your heart is a process, a gradual unfolding. And like that flower, it will bring color, fragrance, and light to your life in ways you might never have imagined. As we move forward, we will explore how this simple yet profound idea is understood through the timeless teachings of Buddhism. Teachings that show us how to cultivate compassion and wisdom hand in hand. We'll look at the challenges we face and the practices that help us live this way, not just as an ideal, but as a living reality. For now, hold this moment of invitation gently. The door is open. Are you ready to step through? Living with an open heart invites us to dive deeper, beyond just feelings or fleeting emotions. To truly understand what it means, we turn to ancient wisdom, Buddhism, a tradition that has explored the heart of human experience for over 2.5 millennia. In Buddhist teachings, the open heart is not just a poetic ideal. It is a living, breathing reality shaped by two powerful forces: compassion and wisdom. These two are inseparable, like two wings of a bird, lifting us beyond suffering and into true freedom. Compassion, or metta in Pali, is the boundless wish for all beings to be free from suffering. It's more than just feeling sorry for someone. It's a deep, active kindness that reaches out without hesitation. This love is unconditional. It doesn't depend on who you are or what you have done. It's a fierce, tender presence that says, "I see your pain and I am here." Yet compassion alone is not enough. Without wisdom, compassion can become overwhelmed, confused, or misplaced. Wisdom, or panna, is the clear insight into the nature of reality. The understanding that everything changes, that attachment causes suffering, and that all beings are interconnected. Imagine wisdom as the light that reveals the path, and compassion as the warmth that fuels our journey. Together, they guide us to open our hearts without losing ourselves. Buddhism speaks of the four immeasurables, Brahmaviharas, four sublime states of mind that cultivate the open heart. These are metta, loving kindness, the sincere wish for happiness and well-being for all; karuna, compassion, the wish to relieve the suffering of others; mudita, sympathetic joy, the ability to genuinely rejoice in others' happiness; upekkha, equanimity, a balanced mind that remains calm amid life's ups and downs. These qualities are not distant ideals but practical tools for daily living. When we nurture them, our hearts soften, and we begin to see the world and ourselves with greater clarity and kindness. This is where the wisdom of impermanence, anicca, plays a crucial role. Everything changes, every feeling, every circumstance. When we embrace this truth, we stop clinging to pain or joy as if they were permanent. Our hearts become more flexible, more open, because we no longer resist the flow of life. And this flow is not just outside us, it's within. Our own thoughts and emotions are constantly shifting. An open heart learns to embrace this inner movement without judgment, allowing compassion and wisdom to grow naturally. Living with an open heart, then, means cultivating this balance, loving deeply while seeing clearly. It means responding to life's challenges not with fear or anger, but with kindness rooted in understanding. It's a journey of learning to meet ourselves and others exactly as we are, with honesty and gentle acceptance. And through this, we find freedom, not the freedom to escape life, but the freedom to fully live it. As we move forward, we will explore the inner barriers that keep our hearts closed, the fears and wounds that build walls around us. Understanding these obstacles is the next step in opening the door wider, allowing compassion and wisdom to flow more freely. For now, hold on to this thought. An open heart is both a gift and a practice. It's the gentle art of loving and knowing at once, a balance that guides us toward true peace. To live with an open heart is a beautiful aspiration, but it's also one of the greatest challenges we face. Why? Because the heart is fragile, and over time it builds walls, barriers forged from fear, pain, and deep-seated habits we often don't even recognize. These inner barriers are not weaknesses, they are survival strategies. They arise from our need to protect ourselves from hurt and rejection, from memories of wounds that still echo within us. They form the invisible fences that keep us from fully opening up to life and love. Fear is perhaps the most powerful of these barriers. Fear of being vulnerable, of being hurt again, or of facing uncertainty. It whispers in our minds, better to stay closed, better to keep safe. But in doing so, fear cages the heart, cutting it off from the warmth and richness of true connection. Alongside fear lies hurt, old wounds that linger beneath the surface, shaping how we see ourselves and others. These wounds might come from childhood, from relationships, or from moments of betrayal and loss. They create patterns of avoidance or anger, reinforcing the walls around our hearts. And then there's conditioning, those habitual ways of thinking and feeling handed down by family, culture, or life experience. Conditioning teaches us to hide emotions, to judge ourselves harshly, or to believe we are unworthy of love. These patterns become invisible chains that limit how freely our hearts can open. Buddhism offers profound insight into these barriers. It teaches us that these fears, hurts, and conditioned patterns are part of the mind's fabric, but they are not our true nature. They are like clouds obscuring the sun, temporary and ever-changing. The path to an open heart begins with awareness. Noticing these barriers without judgment is the first courageous step. When we bring gentle attention to our fears and wounds, we begin to loosen their grip. This process is often uncomfortable. It asks us to face what we've tried to avoid, but it is also deeply healing. Mindfulness is a key practice here. By observing our inner experiences with kindness, we learn to hold our pain without being overwhelmed. Instead of reacting with avoidance or anger, we create space for healing. This space is where transformation begins. Compassion toward ourselves is equally essential. We often demand perfection or harden our hearts against pain, but Buddhism invites us to treat ourselves with the same tenderness we wish for others. Self-compassion softens the defenses and opens the door to true healing. It's important to remember that breaking through these barriers is not a one-time event. It's a continuous practice, like tending a garden. Some days the heart feels wide open, other days the walls creep back in. The journey is about patience and persistence, gently returning to the path each time. When we dare to face our inner barriers, something remarkable happens. The heart begins to expand, and fear loses its power. Hurt transforms from a wound into a teacher. Conditioning becomes a story we no longer need to be bound by. And through this process, we come closer to the authentic self beneath the pain and fear, a self that is naturally open, loving, and wise. As this chapter closes, consider this. The barriers within are invitations in disguise. They call us to courage, to honesty, and to the deep work of opening the heart. It's not easy, but it's the doorway to freedom. Next, we will explore the practical steps and meditative practices that help cultivate this openness. How can we nurture the heart's natural capacity for compassion and wisdom amidst life's challenges? That's where our journey heads now, deeper into the art of living with an open heart. As we step further into this journey of living with an open heart, the question naturally arises: how do we cultivate such openness in the midst of life's complexities? How can we train the heart to soften and expand, even when fear and conditioning pull us back? Buddhism, with its rich tradition of mindful living, offers us a treasure trove of practical tools designed precisely for this purpose. These practices aren't just abstract teachings. They are lived experiences, time-tested ways to nurture compassion and wisdom in the very core of our being. One of the most foundational practices is mindfulness meditation. Mindfulness invites us to turn our attention gently inward, observing our thoughts, feelings, and bodily sensations without judgment or resistance. It's like becoming an attentive witness to the flow of life within us. Through mindfulness, we begin to notice the subtle moments when the heart tightens, the quickening of breath with anxiety, the sinking feeling of sadness, or the flicker of irritation. Rather than reacting or shutting down, we learn to hold these moments with kindness, creating a safe space where the heart can gradually open. Closely linked to mindfulness is the practice of loving-kindness meditation, or metta bhavana. This meditation trains us to cultivate boundless goodwill toward ourselves and all beings. We silently repeat phrases such as, "May I be happy," "May I be safe," "May I live with ease." Then gradually extend these wishes outward, to loved ones, strangers, even those we find difficult. This practice is transformative because it rewires the heart's habitual responses. Instead of retreating into fear or judgment, we train the heart to radiate warmth and acceptance, to embrace the fullness of life with gentle courage. Another powerful practice is Tonglen, a Tibetan Buddhist meditation of giving and receiving. In Tonglen, we breathe in the suffering of others with compassion and breathe out relief and healing. This radical openness breaks down the illusion of separation and cultivates profound empathy. It reminds us that an open heart is not only soft, it is also courageous and willing to bear the weight of another's pain. Alongside meditation, Buddhist teachings emphasize the importance of ethical living, the practice of right speech, right action, and right livelihood. Living ethically aligns our hearts with our values, reducing inner conflict and fostering harmony. When our actions reflect compassion, the heart naturally opens wider. Daily life becomes a field for practice. Simple acts of kindness, patience with difficult people, and mindful listening all contribute to cultivating an open heart. The key is consistency. Small moments repeated daily build a foundation of genuine openness. It's also vital to nurture equanimity, the ability to stay balanced amid life's ups and downs. Equanimity doesn't mean indifference. It means holding joy and sorrow with equal respect and steadiness. This balanced heart is less likely to be overwhelmed or closed off by fear and pain. Finally, the communal aspect of practice cannot be overlooked. Engaging with a spiritual community or sangha offers support, inspiration, and shared wisdom. Knowing we are not alone in this journey helps the heart to trust and unfold more freely. Each of these practices, mindfulness, loving kindness, tonglen, ethical living, equanimity, and community, are threads in the fabric of an open heart. They teach us not only to soften but also to strengthen, not only to receive but also to give. As we weave these threads into our daily lives, the heart becomes a living sanctuary of compassion and wisdom, able to meet life fully, without fear or hesitation. The path is ongoing, and like any art, it requires patience and gentle persistence. But the reward is profound, a heart that lives wide open, embracing both the beauty and the challenges of existence with grace. Next, we will explore how living with an open heart transforms our relationships, how compassion and wisdom reshape the way we connect with others, and ultimately, with ourselves. Living with an open heart is not just an inward journey. It is a way of being that reshapes every interaction, every moment of our daily lives. When the heart opens, it sends ripples outward, transforming how we relate to others and how we experience the world around us. Our relationships are the most vivid arenas where the heart's openness is both tested and expressed. It's easy to hold an open heart in solitude or meditation, but living openly means bringing that same warmth and courage into the messy, unpredictable dance of human connection. When fear and judgment fade, compassion steps forward. We begin to see others not as obstacles or sources of frustration, but as fellow travelers, each carrying their own struggles and hopes. This shift transforms our reactions from defensiveness to curiosity, from blame to understanding. The Buddhist principle of interdependence reminds us that no one exists in isolation. Our lives are intertwined in countless, often unseen ways. An open heart recognizes this web of connection and responds with care rather than indifference. In practical terms, living openly means practicing deep listening, truly hearing another person without planning a reply or rushing to fix things. It means holding space for others' pain and joy alike, without judgment or interruption. This kind of presence is a rare gift and a powerful way to open hearts, including our own. Equally important is authentic communication, speaking our truth with kindness and honesty. When we express our feelings and needs openly, without blame or attack, we invite others to do the same. This mutual vulnerability deepens trust and intimacy, breaking down walls built by misunderstanding. Living openly also means embracing forgiveness, both of ourselves and others. Holding onto resentment and anger keeps the heart closed and heavy. Forgiveness frees us from the past, allowing love and compassion to flow freely again. In daily life, an open heart encourages us to see the sacred in the ordinary. Whether we're washing dishes, commuting, or sharing a meal, each moment becomes an opportunity to practice kindness, patience, and gratitude. Buddhist teachings remind us that the way we treat the smallest moments reflects the openness of our heart. By bringing awareness and compassion into routine activities, we transform them into acts of love and presence. At the same time, living openly means embracing impermanence, the understanding that all things change. When we accept this truth, We stop clinging so tightly to outcomes, people, or ideas, and instead, we flow with life's rhythms. This acceptance is a doorway to freedom and peace. Finally, an open heart in daily life encourages us to serve others selflessly. Acts of generosity, big or small, remind us that giving is a path to receiving. In giving, the heart expands. In serving, we find connection and meaning. Through these ways, listening deeply, speaking authentically, forgiving, embracing impermanence, and serving with compassion, the open heart becomes a living force that heals not only ourselves but the world around us. This transformation is subtle but profound. As the heart opens, it reshapes the very texture of our days and the quality of our relationships, inviting us into a life rich with love, understanding, and joy. Coming next, we will delve into the inevitable challenges of this path. How do we hold onto an open heart when life brings pain, loss, and disappointment? How can we remain gentle yet resilient in the face of adversity? Our journey continues into the heart's true strength. There is a saying in Buddhism that the truth is best understood not only through teaching, but through story, through the lived experiences of those who embody the Dharma. Stories have a unique power to touch the heart directly, to spark awakening and inspire us to open ours even wider. In this chapter, we enter the world of stories, real-life moments and timeless parables that illuminate what it truly means to live with an open heart. Consider the story of the Buddha himself, Siddhartha Gautama, who left behind a life of luxury to seek the truth of suffering. His journey was one of deep openness, opening to the vast reality of human pain without turning away. Under the Bodhi tree, when faced with the darkest fears and doubts, he chose not to close his heart but to meet everything with fearless compassion and insight. This ultimate openness transformed not only his own life, but the lives of countless others, showing us that true freedom arises from the courage to open fully, even when it feels terrifying. Then there are stories from the lives of great Buddhist teachers, such as Thich Nhat Hanh, whose gentle presence and unwavering compassion have touched millions. His teachings remind us that an open heart is accessible to all through mindful breathing, loving kindness, and mindful action. One of his famous anecdotes tells of how he greeted soldiers on the battlefield with compassion rather than hatred, holding space for the humanity even in those who cause harm. This radical openness to suffering, even in enemies, is a profound lesson in courage and love. Stories from ordinary people also shine brightly. Imagine a mother who, after losing her child, chooses to dedicate her life to helping other children in need. Her grief, instead of hardening her heart, becomes a source of deep compassion that heals and uplifts. Or consider someone who, after years of bitterness towards a difficult parent, slowly opens to forgiveness and understanding, transforming a painful past into a source of peace and connection. These stories show us that living with an open heart is not about perfection or constant happiness. It's about the willingness to be vulnerable, to face life honestly, and to respond with kindness and wisdom. In every story, the open heart acts as a bridge, connecting pain with healing, isolation with community, fear with courage. The Dharma itself is full of such stories, parables that teach through metaphor and example. The story of the mustard seed, for instance, shows that suffering is universal and that healing comes through shared compassion. Or the tale of the wounded swan who learns to trust again reminds us that the heart can mend and fly freely once more. As we listen to these stories, they become mirrors reflecting our own potential. They invite us to see that no matter our wounds or fears, the open heart is always within reach. And so, inspired by these lives and lessons, we find the strength to continue, to open again after every closing, to love more deeply despite the risks, to walk the path of the heart with courage and grace. The final chapter will bring us home, reflecting on what it means to live fully with an open heart, embracing all that we are and all that life offers. As we come to this moment together, it's clear that living with an open heart is not a destination but a journey, a lifelong unfolding of courage, compassion, and wisdom. The path we have explored is both simple and profound. To open the heart means to let go of fear, to embrace vulnerability, and to step into the world with kindness and presence. It's a call to live fully, with all the beauty and pain that life brings. This journey is never without its challenges. Sometimes the heart will close out of hurt, confusion, or exhaustion. But the beauty of the Dharma is that every moment offers a fresh invitation to open again, to soften once more. Embracing life with an open heart means accepting impermanence and uncertainty, finding strength in the flow of change. It means recognizing that openness is not weakness, but the bravest form of strength. We are invited to bring this open-heartedness into everything: our relationships, our work, our struggles, and our joys. Each breath, each moment becomes an opportunity to awaken to love's deeper truth. And while the journey is deeply personal, it is also profoundly connected. The open heart draws us into community, weaving a tapestry of shared humanity and compassion. Remember, the heart's openness can be cultivated like a garden, nurtured by mindful practice, kindness, and patience. It grows stronger when we return to it again and again, especially in the face of difficulty. So as you move forward, carry this invitation gently with you. Let it guide your steps through the ordinary and extraordinary moments of your life. The door has been opened. The invitation stands. Will you step through? Thank you for walking this path with me, and may your heart remain open, wide and free, a source of light for yourself and all those you encounter.